So I thought a lot about how in-groups can exclude people that they are supposedly in solidarity with. And I started thinking about our ways of thinking about inclusion and where we fail to live up to them. Because even though I see a lot of flaws, I still see wonderful ideals to live up to in all the social movements that have led me to where I am today. They've allowed me to feel like I can be a part of a community, contribute to the world in a way that I didn't really think I could before. So while I have a lot of issues with the people I've worked with in the past, I also am very, very grateful to them and everything I've learned from them. All right, now let's begin for reals. All right, so I just talked about the challenge of being inclusive. This is something that I've noticed people in both libertarian schools of thought and people on traditional leftist groups have all struggled with. I would find people that I was working with on the climate march weren't really disability friendly. I would find people I was working with around homelessness not really being trans friendly. I'd find all these spaces where I would have to compromise myself to do the work I wanted to do, which I could only do for so long. And the thing is, I think a lot of people on the right have seen these issues as well. I think of Peter Thiel's Education of a Libertarian essay. I do not agree with his conclusions, but he kind of looks at the same premises that I've seen. He didn't really believe democracy and capitalism were compatible. I don't agree. I don't agree that they are compatible either. You have too many voices that are starting to reveal themselves that were always there, but we're now in a more tightly networked society, and you're not really going to be able to get much done unless you can speak to all the different voices that we have in our world. And I don't think that some harsh centralization impulse that he might espouse is what we want. I am hyper-egalitarian, and I still very much want the equality and equity that I was fighting for with a lot of the people I organized with. And before we get into blockchains or distributed systems, they're not silver bullets, panaceas, anything like that, but there are points in time where you find people are fundamentally able to access new parts of the world that they just weren't before. Those thresholds exist, even with different technologies that we might see, even when they are spread across the world in ways that we might not want necessarily. There are a lot of places that just skipped landlines to go to cell phones, for example. I think of my time in India, and I was just surprised at how there was no or wire infrastructure to put up or take down, and people just used their cell phones. They skipped to that phase where it was easy for them to connect with other people. And I'm thinking that some of the distributed systems that many people are interested in today can maybe allow us to pass some similar threshold. So this is a tree structure that will describe my grievances with one particular community or identity. You can do this with others as well. And I hope it highlights the challenges of just trying to break down differences perpetually. Okay, it's visible there. Good, good. So you see the concept of disability. It's something that I was working with. But if you break it down, you get physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, developmental disabilities, and then mental disabilities. And that doesn't account for cultural differences. This is very much the American version. And you will also see in some cases, I don't know how clear it is, physical and sensory are weaved together. I tried to have blindness and deafness creep into the physical and sensory categories. The point is, it gets complicated. Like, really complicated. And while we can do our best to acknowledge these differences, we have to, there's going to be points where we fall short when we try to do it by ourselves. And you'll see this with many of the political frameworks that people have been using to describe problems and solutions in spaces for struggles for freedom, equity, civil rights, cultural, social, economic rights. Human rights is the one that's strongest in the US and other parts of the West, wherever you want to draw that line. It was very effective when it was used by people who weren't really receiving their rights. If people didn't really have their rights under the US Constitution, they could explicitly call that out. And you have a whole, you'd be able to like trap the oppressor in their own game, so to speak. You're calling out hypocrisy. It's considerably less effective when you're using it to try to impose top-down regime changes, which typically just means the same human rights are violated by the people trying to impose the change as the groups that are violating them far away. You'll see this with Iraq. You overthrow Saddam. You have a regime change there. Then there's a coup d'etat. Then you have the same set of abuses being committed by an even more chaotic government afterwards. And then there's intersectionality, which is the way to go if you're in many of the groups that I organized with. And it's one that, by and large, I really appreciated. It's one that gave me a voice. I wouldn't have been able to be out in public were it not for people going in and trying to break down these complex identities that we might share with each other. But it's also one of the sources of my grievances, too. I'm proud of the people that I've been learning from, be it formally or informally. Audre Lorde, Kimberly Crenshaw, the Combahee River Collective, all activists who have been trying to fight to address complexities in groups that were supposed to accept them. But unfortunately, it becomes difficult to keep that up for a long time. Now, it's just a tool like any other tool. Kimberly Crenshaw herself said that you want to use it where it works. Instead, it is the way to go. It is it's a necessity in any social movement these days. And then something that addresses that goes straight to the point and has roots in post-colonial Marxist thought is subalternity. You'll have people who, by all accounts, cannot express themselves in any political system, despite any rights they may or may not have. If you have somebody who, in theory, is able to vote, but by some reason that people can't understand can't, they would be considered the subaltern. Here in America, if you're homeless, for example, in theory you have the right to vote, but if you have no property attached to your identity, and there's no one who's going to vouch for you, you're ultimately not going to be able to make it to the polls. You're just going to be turned back and denied, just like you might be in any other place you try to get into. And I think that this is really, really powerful in how candid it is about how our structures can ultimately fail to do what we want them to do. On the other hand, I have never really seen it implemented bottom up. It is very much in the ivory towers or the prison cells of Marxism. That's Gramsci specifically. Spent lots of time in prison thinking about this. All right, so I am more optimistic than I might hint at, because overall social movements have gotten more inclusive over time. And you'll see this with the examples I've cited above, transitions from second to third wave feminism, the civil rights movement and its Black Lives Matter successor. In the case of the civil rights movement, you have one towering figure who was elevated, and then you have a whole bunch of people revering him. And we're seeing consequences of that today. There was a lot of sexism in the civil rights movement that people didn't discuss. And because of that, you're not really seeing Martin Luther King be the person that is being championed. You're seeing Ella Baker, somebody who didn't really trust top-down leadership, was a big proponent of political decentralization. She focused on just teaching more activists and making more leaders as the way to go. And with the transition from second to third wave feminism, you're seeing moves from economic, social, cultural rights to trying to redefine womanhood. Who gets to be a woman? I'm personally thankful for this movement. It's where intersectionality came out. It's where the Riot Girl movement came out of. It's what allows me to go into the mainstream as a trans person. I would not have been able to be included in a feminist movement, even though I would agree that more feminism would have been good for all of us. And we want to be able to make sure that we can maintain this trend as we go forward, but we're going to need a fundamental change in the way we do things to do so. All right, this brings me to where we are now. We are in a network society. You've probably heard that a gazillion times by now. But what does that mean? So, I'm loosely borrowing from Alexander Galloway here, and the definition of networks that's used in his fairly old work at this point. 2004 is kind of old by today's standards. Where our role in networks is as connected, collective, and participatory beings or nodes. Whether or not we're directly connected or not, we all have an impact and we're all impacted. And there's a general trend towards decentralization in networks. I would argue that in many ways, the internet as we know it now is still ultimately more decentralized than what we might have had without it. Even though, as many probably have heard in the blockchain space, we can definitely do better. We don't want overheads. We don't want intermediaries. And the structures that will be enabling us to move in that direction would be... sorry. I'm going to go back here. It doesn't really fit where I'm going without going to this first in hindsight. Protocols. Protocols are the small social technical structures that we might use to govern our interactions, be they online or offline. There's protocols when we enter a room, we meet somebody, typically you shake their hand. On the internet, you might interact with somebody by looking at their webpage, going on to type with me. You might have to post by having a HTML page that you use. There's a language that you have to use to be able to be understood on the web. And you can be more connected or less connected depending on how you do that. If you're a web developer, I'm just getting started in that area, you know what happens when you don't have the right meta tags in your pages. You're not really following the protocol very well, and you're going to be left to dry. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit to talk about where protocols have been effective and where they have led us to where we are now. So take note at the bottom point that I have on the state of networks. Typically, where there are more people impacting us than we're impacting them. I put up a web page. Typically, I'm responding to more people than people are going to end up noticing my work. You can have X number of Facebook friends who have impacted you, but you can only speak to so many at a time. You're going to find yourself speaking more easily. It's not that hard to just like put up a web page, put up a Facebook post. At the same time though, whether or not you're heard is dependent on whether or not you have people who are connected to you as, in the more hierarchical Twitter terms, followers. Network connections are not equal. Anybody who's tried to interact with the Twitter celebrity can probably attest to that. How many people can they talk to? How many people listen to them? And you'll see that when people do that, though, they are going to find themselves in a state where they can't really present themselves the same way to all these people who have different conceptions of them or follow them for different reasons. I am very much, as an example, I am very much an outsider in spaces like this. I spend a lot of my time with old school organizers, and I am interacting with people in a different context, trying to take what I've learned in one and trying to apply it in another. I don't know that many raw political organizers in spaces like this, and speaking about that means I have to do my best to change how I do things, lest I partake in context collapse scenario where people are seeing this, a single version of me with their different lenses, their different ways of seeing the world, and they just misplace me, misinterpret me, or they take what I say or do and see it not fitting their worldview, and as such are unable to effectively interact with me. That was the image I wanted to get to here. So this is an example of context collapse. If you want to read more about that, I suggest looking into Dana Boyd's work. She's a fantastic researcher who predicted this and Facebook's data blunder long before anyone else I know of did. So if I were to talk about something like poverty in such a way that people around me were actively trying to address it in policy terms, I might go and find some people who I am organizing with who might get a little impatient with me using those terms. if I have a single platform and a single voice, rather than going off into different places, speaking in different ways, different informal languages, I'm going to have a lot of trouble. Now I want to get into what I mean by community and in what ways we can use that. I think that they're fundamentally different from networks and that they have hard-defined connections between individuals. There are many ways you can be a part of a community. Some of them mean different things at scale, most notably nation states. You're more likely to notice another American if you talk to them when you're outside of America, for example. Yet at the same time, you're almost always going to have close relationships with a family member, no matter where you are. There are people that you use as your anchors. And then people who have the same interests as you, that might determine what you do in your daily life, who you go to, who you work with. And then there's people who you might have had similar experiences with as people who you share the same identity with, that can obviously interweave with all the other different kinds of relationships you might have, but when you try to work with it, you may or may not be falling into the same trap that I mentioned before, where you constantly break down identities. You start to make yourself invisible, others invisible. You start to work with people in a way that doesn't feel authentic to you or another person. And I want to allow us to have clear boundaries on what we mean when we mean community and what we don't mean, and where we define them for ourselves, most importantly. Which brings me to shared narrative. As an organizer, that has been the most important tool I could possibly put together is a shared story. You have it when you're working in a human rights framework. You have it when you're working in a Marxist subalternity framework. You have it when you're working with intersectionality. Broadly speaking, in my case, it would just be, we all suffered the same injustice. We were all homeless, right? So why wasn't the government doing anything for us? What do we do about that? And that would be what rallied us in the heat of the moment to go fight, go try to call our local government on their bullshit. And that was what connected us as well. We knew and trusted each other because we had that shared story. And it's something that I think we're going to need as a baseline before we can have any real sense of community. And to get more into this, I would look up Marshall Gantz's work. He was the organizer for Obama's 2008 campaign. He trained all the local volunteers. And, well, you all know how that turned out. I was just a rodent at the time, but I remember how excited everyone was when Obama was elected. People were spreading that fervor of hope and change like wildfire at that time. And he was a big under-the-hood proponent of that, and he's one of the people that I have learned a lot from in trying to organize myself. But now to what I'm actually proposing and want to build now that I've gotten all these definitions out in the park. So I'm working on a community history book to try to make those shared narratives clear and where people have differences clear as well. You have a blockchain or any distributed ledger that's reasonably secure, where people add entries into their history. And when people don't agree and they fork, you might see a shared version of that history as well. You will have people knowing where they're similar and where they're different. And I think that having this more robust sense of divergent history is really, really important, because, well, one, it organizes groups I'm working with, and any groups that are well organized are that much more dangerous to any unjust force they're trying to fight. I wanted to have a way of codifying my differences and similarities for when I'm organizing. But also, I really think that by having a clear sense of history, you can have people from different schools of thought, Marxists, for example, who would define historical class struggles in a way that people who are looking at a single history book might not have been able to understand or recognize, maybe because they were told a different version of history. I don't know what any of y'all were taught in schools, but growing up I was taught that the American Indians made friends with the Pilgrims, the colonists, when they first came to America, only to learn as I got older that no American colonists spread smallpox and pillaged land, and then forced people who were still remaining off their land onto reservations, where they were, where they are now being fed drugs and alcohol at this point in many cases. So I want to have those alternative versions of history out so that we can have a clear sense of what we're talking about and more groups can come to the table when necessary. I also just don't trust one version of history to begin with, especially when we have history being told by the victors. It's tried and true, unfortunately. And we're not really going to be able to see what possibilities we have without breaking away from that. Now, one of the challenges that I've been thinking about with this new distributed system is how you have an individual privacy protected. Privacy is very important in a lot of libertarian spaces that are interested in blockchains, as well as a lot of left-leaning spaces. I have personally found a little bit of differences on why I think privacy is so important. Or I might be strawmanning here, but the issues that I've seen don't really involve rights so much as safety. A lot of the people I was working with where I live were constantly being watched by the police. And when you don't have a home or you're not able to get around as easily, you're constantly subject to state services that require you to give up information that people might use for unsavory purposes. Sometimes it'll be just arresting you for something somebody else did when you need a scapegoat. And yes, that's happened on more than one occasion with some of the people I've worked with. And as a baseline, I've seen privacy become more important the less power you have. There's a lot of people who might just say that you need privacy only if you're doing something bad. I don't like that narrative because it turns the people who are indifferent into model citizens in a way that people at risk might be hurt by. And you're also just encouraging people to turn a blind eye to the ways that you yourself might be impacted. If suddenly the government turns against you, uses your data for unsavory purposes, a la NSA surveillance, which impacts us all, I don't care if you don't care. It's my business too, honestly. I'm gonna have some beef with you. In the nicest way possible, probably, but... So my solution so far has been to have communities look at each other's identities, decide who they verify, who they trust, while having a collective identity that that's the only thing outsiders might see. So if you're not part of the community organizing in the movement for Black Lives on this system, you're only going to see the movement. You're not going to see the individual members if you wanted to target them. Ideally, this will allow individual at-risk members to be protected, while allowing the movement to be organized and show off its strength to the people that they might be in contention with. So, how do we do that, though? I am still on the fence about that. A lot of consensus measures on blockchain systems are incentivized. You have miners who are paid to validate blocks. You have validators and proof-of-stake algorithms that are there to confirm that the miners aren't hoarding resources or are all part of the same pool. So I think that the solution is to, so far, since we're relying on a more human sense of trust than you might rely on in game theory, is to allow the communities to police themselves, to figure out who they want as members and who they don't. So, if people want to opt in, as you're seeing right there, they're going to need to be validated by the other members of the community before they have their identity become part of the collective one. I don't know where we have consensus placed. If we're going to do like 70%, 90%. There are many different protocols you could use there. That is still up in the air for me, and what that would mean. But now, how do communities break away? Maybe somebody isn't validated. Maybe somebody doesn't feel included after all. And that is why you would do the forking. And soft forks are what you would do if you're just trying to force change from the inside, have people update, or you'll do a hard fork if you just don't want to have any kind of discussion, or you don't really have the power that you need to make the change that you want to see inside your community. You break away, you create a new community, plain and simple. Although, we're going to see later on that there might be some issues with just letting that happen. In many ways, you would be perpetuating a lot of the same conflicts that we're seeing before, but it's a very powerful tool that would allow anybody to start their own community if need be. And as a start, I think that's a good thing. And so a lot of this I've learned from hearing about Ethereum's off-chain governance protocol, which follows its own informal protocols. I have opted out of talking about cryptoecon here because I don't know what kind of incentives I would want to introduce into a community with varying amounts of socioeconomic power. And again, relying on trust above all else. But for a community to be able to govern itself, you would need to have common knowledge. Everybody knows the same set of ideas and measures to be taken when necessary, and to be deliberated on when you need to make moves. Everybody would need to have a voice in the procedure, one way or another. What that means would probably also be up to the community. But as a baseline, fairness would be necessary for anybody to feel like they're a part of this community, whatever it might be. And then you're going to need to make sure that they are considered legitimate, so that they can make moves. And legitimacy here can mean a legitimate threat or a legitimate source of power. You can derive your legitimacy from not really being officially recognized, same as just being considered a friend of another community. In many ways, I feel that would be necessary for the groups that I have in mind here, but you want to have that kind of force for the people who are inside the community. They need to feel like they're a part of something that is going to serve them and support them. And I mean, this is an overarching system here that requires that everyone between communities will follow the same general framework, which requires the entire system to be trusted. Forks are still done inside this same system, so if you think the system is fundamentally flawed, you're not going to be a part of this blockchain or ledger or database. And honestly, I think that shared narrative will do a whole lot of this work when done effectively. You're going to have people who break down their identities to the point where they're very specific, to the point where they move away from marginalized groups that marginalize them in turn, to the point where they finally home, and then from there they'll finally have solidarity with other people so that they can move back up and do whatever they need to do. So, how do we get there? How do we build ourselves back up? I criticized Martin Luther King earlier, or described criticisms that I share with the civil rights movement. It was by and large a centralized movement, but I do think that Dr. King's work was probably the most honest attempt that I know of to try to reconcile differences between different groups. And that isn't to say he wasn't radical. He was very radical. He just looked much less so next to Malcolm X. And there are many who believe that that was an intentional meta decision between all the different strands of activism at the time. So, Beloved Community is the attempt to create nonviolent action and use it to its fullest potential for a more inclusive community. Now, Dr. King talked about it in the context of poverty, racial justice, and unity, broadly speaking. He was a Christian, but you can just read him existentially as well, and it works out pretty nicely, I think. It doesn't really deny differences between groups, and it directly invokes our senses of interconnectedness. And how do we get a protocol that allows us to use this in our system? Well, I think that by necessity it has to be altruistic. It requires us to give up some part of ourselves, which we may already be doing. A lot of the groups that I think would benefit from using this, the people I've worked with, they are in many ways already doing that. You gotta give up part of yourself every day to go and be a part of a system that isn't really working for you. If I can run everywhere, for example, I used to do that. If I was black, though, I might not be able to do that the same way without getting stopped by the many, many gung-ho police that live in my town, who have been hounding people day and night, constantly keeping people on the move if they're out and about. And I think that the shared history element of this chain or system will allow us to invoke a sense of community between these groups to avoid people just breaking away endlessly. To have that shared history, you need to be able to reference other groups which could force a dialogue with them, where you both have to add it to your own ledger or chain to maybe make a new history together. And then from there, you've already set up a little foothold from which you can create a new community, reconverge into a new chain. Maybe it requires just starting a new one altogether that everyone is a part of, where you see the final entry, final block, so to speak, as the convergence point. Now here's where I am with this. I still don't know if that solves the question of forking, where you're being coercive, successionary, or just forcing division. I hate those accusations personally when I'm working as an organizer. If you try to bring something up and you're accused of being divisive, it typically means you're not going to be listened to. And of course, why would anybody use this? I have deliberately kept a lot of my interest in tech outside of the communities that I've been working with. A lot of them do not trust it. I have been a bridge for some people, but for many others, it's been a little bit of trouble. And maybe that just means I need to listen more. And I think that's okay for now, but I also just explicitly trying to break those silos, these local networks that prevent us from working with each other. And so we can have a stronger sense of history, a stronger sense of community. And I think I used up more time than I had hoped, but yeah, I want to hear what y'all think, because I am still uncertain about so many different things on this end. Yep, Andrews?
I think I see three components, like technologically that could be built. There's the, and kind of three major issues as well, going with this. So there's kind of distributed writing tools.
Yeah.
Tools for coalescing narrative. That might be the second one, kind of separately. The tools for actually writing the text, and then the tools for putting those things together and building a shared group identity. And then there's this third problem of like, how do I create influence over there? If I'm in this community or this network, how do I impose influence over there to get people to stop abusing other people? And that's an ethical problem, because you know, if I'm imposing something over there, how is that different from like that guy imposing something on this disabled person that they don't like? So it's like a tech and a practical and an ethical problem. But I think overall, I think what you're saying makes sense, because you're saying like you can form small grassroots communities, and they can write together a shared identity and present that externally, and then these can form larger and larger groups. So you're just talking about like a way to massively build solidarity and materially grounded identity politics. So we're speaking for ourselves and not for others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the inter-community interaction is something I'm still having trouble with. I wanted to deliberately avoid people imposing their will upon others. That's part of why I wanted to have the shared history element of this, to create that common ground for people to come together, if possible. A big part of Martin Luther King's project was the need to interact with other people as a necessity for a just world. You can't really win your own freedom without convincing others that their freedom is dependent on your own. Hearing his discussions on the interconnectedness of our global community was a big inspiration for me and my reasoning for doing this kind of work.
You talked about kind of this idea of like social movements being either top-down, like in kind of the case of the civil rights movement, or bottom-up, and then you also talked about this idea of like social movements having members that have various identities in terms of having like suppressed various identities to be a part of that movement. Have you sort of studied like different movements in terms of just like raw effectiveness, and what is the most effective sort of model of like achieving whatever change you want? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? It's probably not binary, but I'm just curious if you've looked at it through the lens of effectiveness, and then like, and then how does like the sort of either encouraging multiple identities to be a part of a movement, or sort of like trying to create one group identity, does that make it like more or less effective?
So one of the most striking things I've noticed when looking at social movements is how important timing is. How much factors beyond your control impact how effective you are. If you went to the Women's March, you saw how big the turnout was after people were just taken aback by Donald Trump's election. A few months later, you go to the March for Science or the Climate March, you're not going to find that same energy. People had thought that they did their part, did their time, and I think that a lot of tactics will depend on where you are at a given moment. The people who were working the Women's March were taking advantage of that energy that was sweeping America at the time. Doing the exact same thing in the case of the Climate March was less effective. But the Climate March specifically, I can speak to a centralization impulse that the organizers, at least in New York, had. They wanted to have everyone go on a bus to DC rather than organize locally, which meant that people who might not have been able to go for work, for the large crowds, couldn't really do anything. I would find in them trying to take oxygen from these movements. That's the words of one of the leaders, not mine, by offering a bus to some of the members of a group that was being organized. They wanted to have everyone go, and I think it was less effective. A lot of people were very angry about that, and they didn't steer off course. And I think that some of the tactics that we use, if we don't adapt them to the force of the times, will be less effective. This is speaking more to the strategy that you would need, that shared narrative that you would need to bring people together. Tactics would have to come after, I think.
So I see how this can be used to preserve history and to allow marginalized groups to have a say in what that history is, but I'm not sure how it would help build a consensus between different narratives.
That's really what I'm struggling with here. It's, oh, I love how many comments I'm about to get. In fact, rather than speak on this, I want to hear what everyone else has to say on this. Morgan, we'll go from left to right.
Yeah, I just have a few comments, maybe something to respond here. So first of all, like I would recommend looking at version control as maybe a better metaphor than blockchain.
Okay.
For what you're talking about, partly because it has a notion of merging.
Yes.
Which is probably pretty useful to you. The other thing I was wondering about as we were speaking was whether you distinguish between history and record keeping. Because it sounded like you were looking for bits of both. History, I would think, was a compressive process where you're taking complex events and defining a narrative out of it, whereas record keeping is easier to do and involves sort of generating voluminous records and things that are harder to access, but capture the kind of full detail of the thing. Just thought, and then the other thing is for like what, you're talking about building something, what is it actually? I wonder, actually, what people use now to organize. So like, I don't know if you know about Lumio, which is like a platform for like democratic decision making. There are also writing tools. I mean, I think all writing tools are terrible. So writing tools are much needed, but anyway, if you can answer quickly, like what does Women's March use to organize their activity? I have no idea.
Okay, so in the case of the Women's March, they would be using a lot of local organizers to mainly pick up the slack and leave it to them. and then they would just keep a database of all the people that they expected to attend. The climate march, from what I saw, was pretty much the same. We were working with a database of people to canvas, to call, to message, based on all the local hubs that we organized around. There'd be like a Buddhist hub, there'd be a Christian hub, there'd be a feminist hub, a mental health hub. All these different ideas and identities were our pivoting points to get more people to join us.
So I guess one way I've been thinking about identity lately has been as a conjunctive or a disjunctive thing. Like, is your identity like this part of me and this part of me and this part of me, or is my identity this part of me or this part of me or this part of me? And I guess I think like the intersectionality movement is I think very much like the and-based form. I think the or-based form kind of inspired by Christopher Poole's essay on the prismatic identities. He's one of the founders of 4chan and stuff, or I don't know, founder moved. But he has this idea that like by allowing for like different pseudonyms, you can like put on different hats and kind of like explore different parts of your identity. But I think this also kind of gets to your point here about like the Women's March organizing having like sort of like a broader like kind of purpose, I guess, but then allowing for like people to express like one part of their identity and like all come together based on that one part. I think like a more like or-based identity, view of identity, allows you to like create more bridges between like different groups, because like someone who might be a part of like the, I don't know, so someone who might be part of like one scene who, like this one scene that doesn't really interact with much of one scene, but like there's one person who kind of like sees themselves in both, then like they can act as like a bridge. But if like this one person instead sees like, oh, I need to find a community that like has both of these scenes together, like there's less of a community there for them to find, and like there's less like kind of like maybe power there for them to like kind of like spread the messages of like both of these things that they find as important.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll have to check out that essay. But I think that we're seeing tensions with the context collapse there, where people who might not completely have a voice in one dimension have more of a voice in another dimension that the other people that they're with in a given group don't have. And while that can serve as a bridge, the point of intersectionality, or in ideal, if not in practice, has been to allow people to embrace those complexities. And it's less about saying, I have multiple identities, rather than just looking at how they build on each other in a different case. There was a case in Florida a while back of an autistic child who just fell out in the street. And then there was a person who was working with them, they were black, being out there, the cops came after them. That situation was perpetuated by both something that people with autism might go through. In this case, from what I read, it was sensory integration, just being unable to handle all the inputs that were coming in and just shutting down because of that. And then there was just the general police bias that we're working with right now. And you'll see that and if you read a lot of Audre Lorde's work, she'll go into a lot of spaces where feminists are organizing, find herself unwelcome, and then go into civil rights spaces and find herself unwelcome. So it's a matter of seeing where your specific experience impacts what happens in a given context.
All right, I think I'm going to stop this here because we're running out of time and people want to come in for the next session. But thank you very much for presenting and for leading this discussion. I think we can have more conversation in the halls. All right, thanks.